Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, depending on where you're seeing us from. Hi, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar. The focus will be the power of reading and acquisition, resources and activities for EFL teachers and students. Welcome to all of you who are joining us live. Hello to Bolivia, hello to Peru, hello Ecuador, hello all of the places that are joining us. Hello to Africa from all over the world. Great. So let's get started. Okay. Hello, Anita. Nice to see you. Today, we're going to be looking at a couple different things within the topic of reading. We have a lot to cover in a little time. So we're going to start with a little bit of theory, what second language acquisition theory says about reading and acquisition. We're going to look at some free online library resources for you and your students. We're going to take a look at reading as a skill with pre-reading, while reading, and after reading. And finally, we're going to take a look at a couple of fun strategies to motivate students to read out loud in class. So, to get started, I would like those of you who are watching right now live in the chat, please share with us. How do you motivate your students to read? This is a difficult question, I think, because a lot of us live in cultures and societies that are not fans of reading. I think with social media and all of the things that we have nowadays, students are more likely to spend time watching videos on their phones than reading books or reading different materials, right? So how do you motivate your students to read? Go ahead and share that with us in the chat. Hello, everybody just joining us. Hello to Pakistan. Nice to have you here with us. Okay. So we know from scientific research that reading is what we can consider to be the engine of acquisition. Studies in the last decade done by linguists such as Stephen Krashen, Benico Mason, etc., have shown that reading, especially reading short stories, is one of the most successful ways to acquire a language. Why is this the case? Because reading is another source of comprehensible input. If you're not sure what comprehensible input is, you can go back a couple months and take a look at the video that was recorded on the RELO Andes page about input and input activities, and you can learn more about input. Hello, Santi. Nice for you to join us. Okay. Another thing that we have been learning a lot about as linguists in the last decade is something called GSSR. This is guided self-selected reading. This is a concept developed primarily by Dr. Benico Mason, who is a Japanese linguist. There you have in parentheses her website. If you would like to visit her website, she has a lot of information about guided self-selected reading, as well as some resources that are free for you to use. What does guided self-selected reading refer to? It refers to the possibility of students being able to choose the reading materials that they are most interested in reading within a set of materials that the teacher determines is appropriate for those students. So in other words, we can develop a list of, let's say, 20 short stories, right? And the teacher can give this list to the students and say, okay, students, here is a list of 20 short stories. I want you to choose the one you would like to read, right? That's why it's self-selected, but it's guided because the teacher intervenes, right? The teacher guides the readings. Okay, so that's what we're referring to. And we also have a Facebook page here that is story listening and guided self-selected reading. I encourage all of you to follow this Facebook page because it also has a lot of free and interesting resources for you as teachers if you would like to develop reading more in your classroom. So go ahead and follow this Facebook page that we have right here. I'm looking at the chat. Atha is telling us that by creating curiosity among young learners, this is a way that they promote reading or motivate their students to read, which is really excellent. Okay. We have this quote here also from Dr. Beniko Mason, who I mentioned is a Japanese linguist, and she says the best way to improve in a foreign language is to do a great deal of comprehensible, interesting reading. Yes, this is not just her opinion. This is something that she says based on scientific research about language acquisition and how humans best acquire a language. So we know, especially from the last 10 years of scientific research, that reading, and especially reading short children's stories, is fundamental in acquisition. Right? The language is simplified, the language is comprehensible, there are pictures to go along with the language to help comprehension. So these types of stories are a great resource for students and teachers to work with to really acquire the language in a meaningful way. Okay, here I have composed a very short list of some free online libraries that you can access from anywhere in the world, right? Because this is the World Wide Web. So anywhere in the world, you can access these libraries. These are just 3 that I mentioned here. But if you do a Google search and you ask Google for free online international libraries or EFL libraries or something of the sort, you will find lots more. But these are a few that I like. So we have the first one, which is Unite for Literacy, www.uniteforliteracy.com, which is basically a huge online library of children's books that are divided into different categories, like fantasy or comedy or different things like that, right? Different types of genres of books. We also have en.childrenslibrary.org, which you can see there. This one actually provides books in several languages. So if you happen to teach English and French, for example, or English and German, you also have books that are in different languages. But in this one, there are over 3,000 English books in the English section of the library that you can access, again, for free. We also have openlibrary.org, and I included a little bit more of the web address here so that you could be focused specifically on books that are appropriate for our students, because this is an open library that also includes adult books, right? But this, if you put collections/K-12, then you will have books that are appropriate for kindergarten through 12th grade, which is the last year of high school, at least in the United States schooling system. These books on this webpage are divided into grade levels. So if you want something that is appropriate, for example, for first grade, which means 6 years old, right? You can go to the tab that says first grade, and it will show you a series of books that are appropriate for first grade. These are materials that native speakers of English also work with. And it has been shown that working with authentic materials, like materials that native English speakers also work with, is very effective for acquisition. So these 3 pages are excellent resources that we can use in order to help our students to access material that is written in English, but real stories, right? Okay. Santi makes a comment in the chat and says, if readings interest learners, they will be ready to read and enjoy them. Absolutely, Santi. I totally agree with you. And in fact, that's something we're going to take a look at in a few moments. Okay. Another resource that we have that's an outstanding resource is American English. You can access this webpage, americanenglish.state.gov, right? And there is a ton of resources. There are a ton of resources on this page for everything, for grammar, vocabulary. It's really an outstanding web page. There's also a Facebook page for American English for teachers that you can access on Facebook that also has a lot of resources. This is sponsored by the US Department of State. And here I have a little screenshot. If you go to this web address right here, americanenglish.state.gov/4-skills-resources, and you scroll down on the page, you will reach a part that says reading, because this includes the 4 skills, right? So reading, writing, speaking, and listening. But I took a screenshot of the reading section. And as you could see here, just from the screenshot, we have reading materials for classroom and student use. And so you have, again, free books online. And there are several more. As you can see, you can actually touch the arrow here and you can see more books that are appropriate for your students, and you can access them. And they even include some activities to work with. So this is an outstanding resource for you to work with also with your students. Okay, going back to Santi's comment here, the most important considerations for choosing a reading are 3. There are other considerations, but the most fundamental are these: the English level, right? Is the level of the language appropriate for our students? If we choose a reading that is too complex for our students, that is too difficult for them, you know what happens, right? Teachers, you've experienced this. Your students are discouraged. They don't want to read. They're shut down. They say, I'm not reading this, teacher. I don't understand English. I don't know this, right? And automatically, we won't be able to advance with them because the reading is too difficult, right? So we need to choose a reading that is at or just above the level of our students, right? The English level is very important. Age appropriateness. Not all topics are appropriate for all ages, right? So we need to consider what topics our students can deal with. We can find a reading that's not very complicated and we say, okay, I can work with my 8-year-olds or 9-year-olds, but then the reading is about, for example, politics. That's not appropriate for 8 and 9-year-olds, right? So we need to find topics that work and an English level that works. And of course, not less important, but also extremely important, is what Santi mentioned to us earlier: student interest, right? If our students are not interested in the reading, they will not want to read it. This is common sense, right? So if I'm teaching students of high school, for example, 15, 16 years old, yeah, I don't want to choose a reading about the American Civil War because most high school students do not care about the American Civil War, right? But if I choose a reading about the top 10 most famous YouTubers, for example, suddenly they're interested. Or if I choose a reading about the history of WhatsApp, suddenly my students are more interested and therefore they're more motivated to read, and therefore they have lower effective filters, right? Which was discussed in a previous webinar, and they can absorb the information better. They can absorb the English better, right? If they're excited about the topic, if they're interested in learning about the topic. Now, before we continue, I want to make a parenthesis here. I'm sure that it has happened to you teachers out there, those of you who are joining us, Patricia, Alfredo, Jesus, hello. I'm sure that you can say you have experienced this. At some point, you give your students a text, right? And the student looks at the text and says, no, I don't understand, or they speak to you in Spanish. No entiendo, teacher. No entiendo nada, right? Okay. What do we do with this? Yeah. When your students are so blocked, they're so intimidated by reading in English, what can we do to make them less intimidated, to make them feel more comfortable reading in English? Here's a suggestion. Take the first paragraph of the text, okay? And you as the teacher can signal words that you know that your students know, okay? So let's imagine I'm reading the first paragraph and I say, oh, problem? You don't understand that word? And they say, no, yes, of course, teacher, that we understand. Oh, okay. University, you don't understand that word? Yes, teacher, we understand that word. And you keep reading, right? And you say, interesting? You don't understand that word? Yes, teacher, we understand. Okay, right? So you have to make them realize that they actually understand a lot more than they think that they understand, right? Because students become easily intimidated by looking at a whole page of a foreign language. But if we empower them by telling them, actually, you understand a lot of this already, suddenly they are left without an argument, right? They're left without an argument and they feel empowered and they feel more confident to be able to read the text. Yeah. Okay. One thing is reading a text to acquire vocabulary, to acquire language, to acquire grammar, okay, as a source of input. That is one thing. That is one function, let's say, of reading in a foreign language. But another function is reading as a skill, okay? Because language acquisition and acquiring a grammatical system in a language is different, is a separate mental process than developing the skill of reading in a language, okay? So here I'm going to focus specifically on a reading lesson. Like, how do I go about teaching reading, but as a skill? Today, I want to develop the skill of reading in my students, right? Okay. And here I would like to have some audience participation. If you can please also share with us some experiences that you have had that have been successful in your classroom when teaching reading as a skill. Okay, so I broke down a reading lesson into 3 main parts. You can see we have a pre-reading, a while reading, and a post-reading. Okay. In the pre-reading section, what is the purpose of doing a pre-reading? It's not just because. It's not because we have to. There is a real purpose for it. And the purpose of doing a pre-reading is to activate what we call schemata. Has anyone heard that term before? Schemata? Maybe this is a new term for some of you. Schemata is essentially what we have in our heads about a specific topic. Okay, so let's imagine that I'm going to do a reading about the 4th of July, which is United States Independence Day, right? I'm going to do a reading about the 4th of July. I need students to activate the schemata that they already have in their brains about not necessarily the 4th of July specifically, but Independence Days in general, right? What do we think of when we think of an Independence Day? Normally, at least in my schemata, I have fireworks, I have parades, I have barbecues, I have flags, I have all of those types of things, national anthems, certain songs. That all of that forms what we call my schemata, my background knowledge, so to speak, my what I know about the topic in general. Okay, so anytime we do a reading, before we start the actual reading, we want to activate the schemata. And this is about anything, right? So if they're going to do a reading about, for example, the history of the internet, yeah, we need to activate their schemata, what they already know about the internet in general, right? And this also helps us to see what vocabulary and grammar students already manage that has to do with those topics, right? What can they already express in English? Do they need more vocabulary in order to understand a reading about the history of the internet, for example, right? Okay. What types of pre-reading activities have you done? What types of pre-reading activities have you seen in the textbooks that you work with? You can share with us, okay? Go ahead and share with us. Like Abel says, the teacher should build his lesson on students' backgrounds about the topic he is delivering. Yes, exactly. That's right. Because when we have this type of schemata and we have a new reading, reading comprehension is actually connecting the new reading to the schemata we already have in our heads, right? So that's awesome. Okay, Atha is telling us that they like to work with brainstorming. Brainstorming is good too. Yes, absolutely. Brainstorming. What do we know about this topic? Give me ideas, right? Tell me anything you know, okay? We can work with true false statements. We can tell them to what do you already know about this topic? Trivia, for example. Is this true or false? We can order events, right? Guess the order in which these events will happen, for example. We can ask open questions. We can ask their opinions about things. We can ask a group work. We can do group work, etc. Right? We can do lots of different types of activities to do a pre-reading to activate the schemata that our students have about the topic that they are going to see. They can predict what they're going to read about from the title, right? We can do predictions. We can work with vocabulary. If there's a lot of new vocabulary for our students, we can give them the new vocabulary words, let's say in sentences, and try to have them guess the meanings of the words by the context, okay? There are several different types of activities that we can do for pre-reading, but pre-reading is absolutely necessary. We cannot start a new reading just by saying, okay, let's start reading. That doesn't work, okay? Great. So that's pre-reading. Yes, Santi also says help learners with new or difficult words by showing pictures. That also helps. Yes, anytime we can use realia or images to help our students to decipher new words is excellent. Good. Okay, while reading, let's move on to the while reading section. So what happens while our students are doing a reading? What they need is something that we call guided interaction, right? Guided interaction is something that is teacher-led. You have to guide your students through the reading. It's like you're holding their hands, right? And you walk with them through the reading so that they feel more comfortable. Like Adez says right here, a suitable warmer connected to the topic can do a lot, especially if all students are engaged in the class activities. Right, exactly. Help them to connect with the reading from the beginning, right? As we're going through the reading, we also should be doing some comprehension checks. How can we do this? We can ask specific questions, right? Open questions, closed questions. We can ask a student or someone who volunteers to summarize what is the main idea of this paragraph. It depends on the genre of reading, which are the most appropriate comprehension checks. But we need to be sure that our students are understanding and processing the meaning of the reading as they are reading. We don't have to wait until the end of the reading to say, okay, did you understand everything? We can do this along the way, right? And also vocabulary help, right? So we need to provide our students with vocabulary help. A lot of times they will not understand all of the words. But it is also important to tell our students it's not necessary to understand every single word, because it's not. We can understand a sentence without understanding every single word. Yes, we must understand keywords, but we do not need to understand every word to understand the sentence. And students can also guess the meaning of words through context, right? So if somebody says, for example, they raise their hand and they say, teacher, what does printer mean? Printer, right? You can ask, does anyone understand the word printer? Can someone explain what a printer is in English? Before giving the translation in their native language, challenge their English and make them explain what a printer is, right? A printer is something you use with a computer to produce documents on paper, for example, or something like that, okay? Yes. So this is while reading, making sure that the students are following along, that they're engaged with the reading. We can ask their opinion about things, right? So that they're consistently through each step of the reading, connecting with it and processing it, right? And then in the post-reading part, we can also do comprehension. This is right. We can do comprehension, but we can also do what we call the assimilation phase. What do we mean by assimilation? We mean taking the content of the reading and connecting it to our students' life. Yeah, to what our students experience or know, connecting it to their original schemata, right? So let's go back to the idea that I'm doing a reading about the 4th of July. The United States Independence Day, okay? I can ask in the assimilation phase for students to compare, for example, their Independence Day celebrations with what they have learned about the United States Independence Day celebrations, yeah? So depending on the country that they live in, if they have an Independence Day or if they have a national holiday that celebrates the country, right? So for example, in my case, I live in Ecuador. So I can ask students to compare the 10th of August, which is the day that the Ecuadorians celebrate, to the 4th of July. How are your celebrations similar? How are they different, right? This is personalizing the reading and taking it a step further to make students really connect with the content, right? And it also helps them with more critical thinking, higher order thinking. We know Bloom's taxonomy, the higher levels of thinking. It helps them to synthesize the content of the reading so that they can actually make comparisons with things that they've known before. Yeah. We can ask them to write a continuation. For example, if it's a story, if it's a fictional story, we can ask students to write a continuation of the story, right? We can tell them, okay, write the sequel, part 2. What happens now to the characters? Or we can tell students, rewrite the story from a different character's perspective, right? Instead of the main character, rewrite the story from the perspective of another character. Yeah. This is also something that we can do in post reading to continue with the content of the reading and to make the students connect more with it. Okay. I also encourage you guys to feel free to use AI, artificial intelligence, like ChatGPT and others, to help simplify the level of the text that you might find, right? So if you find a text that you say, wow, this is extremely interesting for my students, right? Like influencers for high school. Yeah. But the text is too complex for their level of English. What can I do? I go to ChatGPT or any AI platform that you use, and you give the order to ChatGPT, simplify the following text to a level, for example, B1 in the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages, right? Simplify the following text to a B1 level in the Common European Framework of References, okay? You give them that comment there, right? And then you copy and paste the text into ChatGPT or any other AI. And what that will do is it will simplify the morphosyntax and also the lexical items, or like the vocabulary and the grammar of the text. And it will give you the same content, but it will give you it in a level of English that's easier. Yeah, so this is really a great tool that we have, and it is absolutely ethical to use artificial intelligence in that way. So I encourage you to, if you find a text that's too difficult, but you want to work with it, ask ChatGPT to simplify the text for you. Okay? Yes, some of you are commenting also in the chat. I like group work. Yes, absolutely. Group work is important with especially heterogeneous groups, especially large groups. I know some of you work with classrooms that are 40 or 50 students. Yeah, so we can always divide them into groups. Atha comments, I perform role play activities, and sometimes I encourage my students to present some alternate ending. That's great, right? Role plays are fun as well. So these are really good ideas. Thank you very much. Okay. Now we're going to take a look at some fun techniques for reading as a class, because I remember when I was in school, a lot of times when we had to read aloud in our classes for science or social studies or literature or anything, the teacher would usually go down each of the rows and have each student read one paragraph. I'm sure some of you can identify with this, right? When you were students. And so what did you do? You sat there and you counted. Okay, I'm student number 8, so I'm going to have to read paragraph number 8. So you counted the text, you found paragraph number 8, and in your head, right, you were already practicing it because you wanted to say it correctly in front of your classmates and in front of your student. You're a teacher, right? Okay. There are some techniques that we can use that are more dynamic, right? And that engage students more in reading out loud as a class. Okay. 2 I mentioned right here on the screen: popcorn reading and spirit reading. What do these entail? Okay, in the case of popcorn reading, right? So in popcorn reading, we have students in the class, right? All of the students, they get to choose who's going to read next. So the teacher says, okay, I'm going to start reading and I'm going to choose a student. And I'm going to announce that student's name by saying the word popcorn. Why popcorn? I don't know. It's just a fun word, right? So this teacher will start reading, once upon a time, there was a young girl who blah, 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 right? The teacher finishes reading a paragraph or something and says, popcorn, Cristina. And then Cristina reads. Cristina can read one sentence, two sentences, three sentences, a paragraph, whatever she wants to read. And when she feels she doesn't want to read anymore, then she calls one of her classmates. So Cristina says, popcorn, Juan. And then Juan continues reading. You see? So it's student controlled. The students get to choose who's going to be the next person to read after them. Yeah. And this is actually very fun for students because teachers, you will notice that the students will laugh and things like that because sometimes the students choose their crush to read next, and then the rest of the class says, "Ooh, you know," but everybody is smiling and they're having a good time, right? So this is really good. Helen, I'm glad that you've used popcorn reading before, so you can tell us about this. That's great. I hope it worked for you. Okay, another technique that we can use is something called spirit reading. So here the idea that there is like a spirit of reading, right? Yes, and the spirit reading is one that travels like throughout the class. Yeah. So this is more based on the inspiration of each student to read. Okay. So what I say as the teacher is, for example, okay, guys, guess what? Today in the classroom, there is a spirit, right? And this is a spirit of reading. And right now, the spirit is right behind me. You see? And you can't see him. It's not, obviously. And I said, right now, I have the spirit with me. But at some point during this reading, the spirit is going to leave me and it's going to travel to one of you. And you have to be open to the spirit. You have to be aware of the spirit's presence. And if the spirit comes to you, that means that it's your turn to read, right? Yeah. And so the teacher starts reading, and the teacher reads a sentence or two sentences or something, and then the teacher is silent, and the teacher waits. 9 times out of 10, in other words, most of the time, another student will continue reading, right? And then that student will read until they want to stop. You can put a limit. You can say maximum 1 paragraph or something if you want, right? And then they stop, and then another student feels inspired to read. Now, sometimes it happens that no students read, that everybody is silent because everyone is waiting for someone else to read. Okay, if that happens in the class, then what I do as the teacher is say, hey, Mario, look, the spirit, it's tapping you on the shoulder. It's right behind you. That means it's your turn, right? And then the class laughs because they know there's really no spirit, but it's fun, right? And so then Mario will continue reading, yeah? And this goes on until you reach the end of the reading. I think it's an important comment that Adele makes to us here about that it may be embarrassing to shy students to do popcorn reading. This is one of the criticisms of popcorn reading. Yes, it may be embarrassing to shy students to do that, to do this. You have to know your classroom, right? You have to know your students. If you have a group of students in which most of them are comfortable with participating, are comfortable with reading and everything like that, go ahead, do popcorn reading. If you have a classroom where you have a lot of shy students, maybe this type of technique will not work for your students. Maybe spirit reading will work better for your students, right? So what's fundamental here is to know your students well enough to be able to choose the technique that works better for your students, right? There's also other techniques like echo reading, where the teacher can read a sentence and the students repeat it back. But a lot of times there, if you feel like they're just doing some kind of repetition and they're not really processing the meaning of the sentences, and it breaks up the fluency of the story. So some people don't like to do echo reading. There's also another technique that's called popsicle stick reading, in which on popsicle sticks, you know, those wooden sticks, right? The teacher writes the name of every student and they put them in like a can, and then they choose a volunteer or choose someone from the class, maybe the shy student, right? And the shy student picks out a popsicle stick and reads the student's name that's on that stick and says, oh, for example, I don't know, Margarita. Okay, so Margarita has to read. Yeah, so these are also techniques that you can incorporate, but usually the ones that seem to be the most dynamic and fun for students are these two that we have here on the screen, our popcorn reading and spirit reading. So I encourage you to try them in your class next time when you read out loud. Another tip for reading out loud is that we have to be careful about correcting students' pronunciation in reading, because what is our purpose when we practice reading? What is our purpose when we work with the skill of reading? Most of the time, the purpose is to understand, comprehend written language, right? If a student is making their best effort to read out loud, you know how embarrassing that is for students, right? You know how stressful that is. You remember as students, I'm sure, how many times you sweat having to read out loud, even in our native languages, right? So we have to be very sensitive as to how we correct pronunciation in reading. I suggest that you do not interrupt the student. I suggest that you allow the student to read until they finish their part. And then if you want to correct pronunciation, you can correct pronunciation in a non-invasive way. In other words, in a way where we just kind of mention it, right? We don't say, oh, you said this wrong. It's not like this, it's like this, because that really hurts the student, right? So we have to be very sensitive when we're correcting students' pronunciation and try not to interrupt them as they are reading unless they cannot pronounce the word, right? Exactly. Okay, this is a good idea. Thank you, Santi, for your comment here. To avoid shyness, ask students to sit on the floor in order for them to feel comfortable, relaxed, and ready to read. Absolutely, yes. Sitting on the floor or sitting in a circle or sitting in a way that makes students feel less rigid and more relaxed is a great suggestion. So thank you very much, Santi, for that comment. Okay. Yes. So to conclude this presentation about reading, we as teachers have the exciting chance to help your students to fall in love with reading. Enjoy it. I'm sure that you, as when you were students, you can remember having read certain books in school that made you inspired, right? Maybe you had a book club at your school. Maybe you had a list of the books you would read in school. Maybe there was a teacher who had you read a book during her class or his class, and you remember that book for the rest of your life. Like me, for example, I remember reading Charlotte's Web, the book about the spider and the pig, when I was in elementary school, and I'll never forget that. I remember reading the book, for example, The Catcher in the Rye in high school, and I'll never forget reading that book, right? I was able to enjoy it, and I know that my teachers had a lot to do with that experience. So we have a lot of opportunity to help our students to fall in love with reading, and it's really a wonderful thing if we can do that, because that's something that we can instill in them for life, right? And they will continue to read, and they will continue to find joy in reading. So I encourage you to read as much as you can with your students, get them to love reading. Don't forget to join us on our follow-up Zoom session at 3 p.m. today. I will be sharing the links if you would like the actual links to each of the resources that I've shared in the PowerPoint. We can also discuss some more techniques to help our students with reading, any experiences that you've had as well. So I'd be very happy to have you guys in the Zoom session at 3 p.m. today so we can continue our discussion. Thank you so much for joining us today in this webinar about reading. I hope you have found it useful and helpful for you, and I will see you next month. Take care, teachers. Goodbye.